The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Derek Matthews, a 45-year-old construction company owner from Texas, wearing a bright red "Make America Great Again" baseball cap and a t-shirt featuring the American flag wrapped around an eagle. His wife Linda tried to blend into the background. Already sensing that Derek's loud personality might cause problems in the refined atmosphere of the royal residence, Derek had insisted on this European vacation to celebrate his company's recent success. But he made no effort to hide his disdain for what he called old-world nonsense. He had spent the flight from Dallas telling anyone who would listen that America had saved Europe twice in world wars and that countries like Britain should be more grateful for American protection and leadership. "Look at this fancy stuff," Derek announced loudly to his wife as they approached the castle gates. "All this pomp and ceremony for what? A bunch of people who live off taxpayer money and pretend they're better than working folks. At least in America, we don't bow down to kings and queens." Linda Matthews had heard variations of this speech throughout their 20-year marriage, but she had hoped that traveling abroad might broaden Derek's perspective rather than reinforce his prejudices. She tugged gently on his sleeve, trying to encourage him to lower his voice as other tourists began staring at them. "Double quotes, Derek. Please," she whispered. "We're guests in their country. Can't we just enjoy the history and tradition without making it political?" But Derek was already working himself up into one of his familiar rants about American superiority and European weakness. The presence of the royal guards in their ceremonial uniforms seemed to trigger something in his personality that demanded he assert his dominance over what he perceived as outdated traditions. Guard Captain William Thornton stood at attention near the main entrance, his scarlet tunic perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat positioned at the precise regulation angle. At 32, he was a decorated veteran who had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious role of protecting the royal family. He took immense pride in upholding centuries-old traditions that connected him to generations of British soldiers who had served the crown. William had noticed the loud American tourists from the moment Derek entered the courtyard. Years of security training had taught him to identify potential troublemakers, and Derek's aggressive body language and confrontational tone were setting off quiet alarm bells. Still, William maintained his ceremonial posture, trusting that most tourists would respect the boundaries and dignity of the occasion as the ceremony began. Derek grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as theatrical nonsense designed to impress gullible tourists. The precision marching, the formal commands, the reverent silence of the crowd, all of it struck him as elaborate pretense that had no place in the modern world. "This is exactly what's wrong with these old countries," Derek said loudly enough for dozens of people to hear. "All show, no substance. These guys are playing dress-up, while real soldiers are fighting actual wars. No wonder they needed America to bail them out every time things got serious." The crowd around Derek began shifting uncomfortably. Many were British citizens who had come to witness a ceremony that held deep cultural and historical significance for them. Others were international tourists who understood they were observing something sacred to their hosts and maintained appropriate respect. An elderly British gentleman named Arthur Pemberton, who had served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands War, turned to face Derek with barely contained anger. "Sir, these guards are active military personnel who have served in combat zones around the world. They've earned the right to participate in these ceremonies through their service and sacrifice." Derek looked Arthur up and down dismissively, taking in the man's modest clothing and weathered appearance. In Derek's worldview, anyone who wasn't obviously wealthy or powerful wasn't worth listening to, regardless of their actual experience or knowledge. "Oh yeah," Derek replied with a smirk. "And what would you know about real military service? You people haven't won a war without American help since, well, probably never. These toy soldiers wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight." The insult to British military capability and history sent ripples of outrage through the crowd. Arthur's face flushed red with anger, but before he could respond, other voices joined the confrontation. My son served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the parachute. Regiment called out a middle-aged woman named Margaret Foster. He lost his leg to an IED while protecting Afghan civilians. Don't you dare call British soldiers toy soldiers. Derek turned to Ward. Margaret, with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never faced serious opposition to his worldview. His success in business had convinced him that his opinions were always correct, and that anyone who disagreed with him was either stupid or jealous of his success. Lady, I don't care what your son did, Derek shot back. The fact remains that without American military power, this whole continent would be speaking German right now. We saved you once, we could do it again if we wanted to. These guards are just for show. They're not real soldiers anymore. Guard captain. Thornton felt every muscle in his body tense as Derek's words reached his ears. He thought of his fallen comrades from Helmand Province, of the Purple Heart in his flat back in London, of the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the early morning hours. But his training held firm. He was a Queen's Guard. And Queen's Guards did not break protocol for ignorant tourists. No matter how offensive their words, Derek noticed the guards' continued silence and interpreted it as weakness rather than discipline. In his mind, a real man would have responded to the insults with anger or confrontation. The guards' professional restraint looked like cowardice to someone who had never understood the difference between strength and aggression. See? Derek announced triumphantly to the crowd. He can't even defend himself or his country. That's the problem with all these European countries. No backbone, no fighting spirit, just fancy uniforms and meaningless ceremonies. Linda Matthews felt mortified by her husband's behavior but had long ago learned that confronting him in public only made his outbursts worse. She stood silently beside him, wishing she could disappear entirely or somehow undo the damage he was causing to their family's reputation. The crowd's hostility toward Derek was becoming palpable. Tourists who had come to enjoy a peaceful cultural experience were instead witnessing an ugly display of American arrogance and disrespect. Many began pulling out their phones to record what was becoming an increasingly volatile situation. Young Jessica Walsh, a university student studying international relations, held her phone steady as she captured Derek's rant. She had written papers about ugly American tourist stereotypes, but she had never witnessed such a perfect example in person. She knew that whatever happened next would likely end up on social media within minutes. Derek seemed to feed off the crowd's attention and disapproval. Rather than recognizing, Derek Matthews stood in the center of what was rapidly becoming a hostile crowd, his red MAGA hat like a beacon drawing angry stares from British citizens who had come to witness their nation's most cherished military tradition. His wife Linda had retreated several steps, desperately hoping that distance might somehow protect her from the embarrassment her husband was creating. You want to know what real leadership looks like? Derek shouted, pointing at his Trump hat. This is what a real leader looks like. Someone who puts his country first, not someone who inherited a crown and lives in a palace while working people pay the bills. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Several British tourists gasped audibly at what they perceived as a direct insult to their monarch and their entire governmental system. Others began muttering angrily among themselves, their voices creating a low rumble of disapproval that seemed to echo off the ancient castle walls. Arthur Pemberton, the elderly naval veteran, stepped closer to Derek with his fists clenched at his sides. You ignorant fool, he said, in a voice shaking with rage. Our Queen has served this nation with dignity for over 70 years. She's witnessed more history and shown more grace under pressure than your precious politician ever will. Derek looked at Arthur's modest clothing and aged appearance and saw only what he had always seen when confronted by people who disagreed with him, someone jealous of his success and threatened by his superior understanding of how the world really worked. Your queen? Derek laughed mockingly. What has she ever accomplished besides being born into the right family? At least Trump built an empire through hard work and smart business decisions. What did your precious royals ever build except castles paid for by peasants? The historical ignorance and deliberate provocation in Derek's statement sent another wave of outrage through the assembled crowd. Margaret Foster, the woman whose son had lost his leg in Afghanistan. Pushed forward until she was standing directly in front of Derek, the Queen served as a mechanic and truck driver during World War II, when she was just a teenager, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through enough history to know what real service looked like. She's been the patron of hundreds of charities and has dedicated her entire life to public service. What has your businessman president done except enrich himself and divide your country? Derek felt his face flush red with anger at being challenged by what he saw as a collection of has-beens and never-weres. In his business dealings back in Texas, his wealth and success usually ended arguments before they could really begin. People who depended on his construction contracts rarely contradicted him directly, and he had grown accustomed to having his opinions treated as facts. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about?" Derek shot back. "Trump made America great again by standing up to our enemies and putting America first. These European countries have been freeloading off American military protection for decades. It's time you people learn to defend yourselves instead of hiding behind our strength. Guard." Captain Thornton continued to maintain his ceremonial position, but the tourist's words were hitting him in places that his professional training couldn't completely shield. He thought about joint operations he had participated in with American forces, about the mutual respect and brotherhood that existed between professional soldiers regardless of nationality. This man's crude nationalism was an insult to the very alliance relationships that had kept the peace for generations. Young Jessica Walsh kept her phone camera trained on Derek as his rant continued. She could see that the situation was escalating beyond mere tourist rudeness into something that could have serious diplomatic implications. An American citizen standing on British soil, insulting the monarchy and military traditions while praising a controversial political figure, was exactly the kind of incident that could strain international relationships. Derek noticed the phones pointed in his direction and seemed to interpret the attention as validation rather than condemnation. In his mind, he was finally getting the platform he deserved to educate these foreign people about American superiority and the failure of their outdated systems. "You people are making the same mistakes that led to 2 world wars," Derek announced to the crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You put your trust in kings and queens and fancy ceremonies instead of strong leaders who know how to make deals and win. That's why you needed American soldiers to come save you from the Germans twice." The reference to World War II struck the crowd like a physical blow. Many of the British tourists had grandparents or great-grandparents who had lived through the Blitz, who had endured rationing and blackouts and the constant threat of invasion. The idea that their sacrifice and resistance was being dismissed as weakness by an ignorant American tourist was more than many could bear. "My grandfather flew Spitfires over London during the Battle of Britain," called out a young man named David Hartwell, his voice shaking with emotion. "He and thousands like him died protecting this country while America was still deciding whether to join the fight. Don't you dare minimize their sacrifice." Derek turned toward David with the same dismissive attitude he had shown everyone else. "Your grandfather was very brave, I'm sure," he said in a tone that made clear he thought nothing of the sort. "But the fact remains that Britain couldn't win without American industrial might and American soldiers. Face the facts. You're a small island that used to have an empire, and now you're just another European country that depends on American leadership." Linda Matthews watched in horror as her husband systematically alienated an entire courtyard full of people who had started the day with neutral or even positive feelings toward Americans. She had tried for years to moderate his political views and his tendency to lecture strangers about topics he didn't really understand, but nothing had ever prepared her for watching him insult an entire nation's military history while standing in front of one of their most sacred sites. The crowd was growing larger as word spread about the confrontation. Palace security officers were making their way through the throng of tourists, but their approach was careful and measured. Incidents involving foreign nationals required delicate handling, especially when they involved citizens of allied countries. Derek noticed the approaching security personnel and seemed to interpret their presence as an attempt to silence him rather than maintain order. His business success had convinced him that he was always the victim of jealous competitors or corrupt officials who couldn't handle his direct approach to problem solving. "Here we go," Derek announced loudly. "Can't handle a little free speech, so you're going to call in the authorities." This is exactly the kind of government overreach that Americans fought a revolution to escape. We don't bow down to kings. We don't let officials silence us when we speak the truth. Guard Captain Thornton felt a deep sadness wash over him as he listened to Derek's interpretation of the situation. The American seemed completely unable to understand that his behavior was offensive not because of his political views, but because of his complete lack of respect for the traditions and sacrifices of his hosts. The security officers reached the edge of the crowd and began the delicate process of assessing the situation. They could see that tensions were running high, that the American tourist had managed to anger dozens of British citizens, and that the incident was being recorded by multiple witnesses. Whatever happened next would likely have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate confrontation. Derek stood at the center of it all, still wearing his red hat like a badge of honor, still convinced that he was the rational voice in a crowd of emotional foreigners who couldn't handle hearing uncomfortable truths about their declining relevance in the modern world. He had no idea that his words and attitude were about to trigger consequences that would follow him long after he returned to Texas. The palace security officers approached Derek Matthews with the measured professionalism that came from years of handling delicate situations involving international visitors. Senior Officer Patricia Henley, a 20-year veteran of diplomatic security, assessed the scene quickly. One agitated American tourist, an increasingly hostile crowd of British citizens, and multiple cameras recording what was rapidly becoming a diplomatic incident. "Sir," Officer Henley said to Derek in a calm but authoritative voice, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice and step away from the ceremonial area. You're disrupting official proceedings and creating a disturbance that's affecting other visitors." Derek turned to face the security officer with the same confrontational attitude he had shown everyone else. In his worldview, authority figures were either allies who recognized his importance or enemies who were jealous of his success. He had dealt with building inspectors and city officials back in Texas through a combination of legal threats and political connections, and he assumed the same tactics would work here. "Officer, I'm an American citizen exercising my right to free speech," Derek announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear every word. "I haven't broken any laws, and I haven't threatened anyone. If these people can't handle hearing the truth about their failing country, that's their problem, not mine." Officer Henley had handled hundreds of difficult tourists over her career, but Derek's combination of arrogance and cultural insensitivity was testing even her considerable patience. The crowd around them was growing larger and more agitated, and she could see that the situation was approaching a tipping point that could result in serious problems. "Sir," she continued, in the same professional tone, "you have the right to express your opinions, but you don't have the right to disrupt ceremonial military proceedings or to create disturbances that affect public safety. I'm asking you to move to the designated tourist areas where you can observe the ceremony without interfering with official duties." Derek looked around at the crowd of British citizens who were staring at him with undisguised hostility and made what would prove to be one of the worst decisions of his life. Instead of accepting the reasonable compromise being offered by the security officer, he decided that this was the moment to make his definitive statement about American superiority and European weakness. "You know what?" Derek shouted, his voice carrying across the entire courtyard. "I'm not moving anywhere. This is supposed to be a free country, right? Well, I'm a free American citizen, and I don't take orders from the servants of some welfare queen who lives in a palace while working people struggle to pay their taxes." The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. The direct insult to the queen, delivered on the grounds of one of her official residences, crossed every line of basic courtesy and respect that even the most patient British citizens were willing to tolerate. "That's enough," Arthur Pemberton shouted, his naval training overriding his civilian restraint. "You've insulted our military, our history, and now our sovereign. You're not welcome here. The crowd began pressing closer to Derek, their anger finally boiling over after listening to 20 minutes of increasingly offensive statements. Officer Henley immediately called for backup through her radio while positioning herself between Derek and the advancing crowd. Guard Captain Thornton, still maintaining his ceremonial position, watched the situation deteriorate with growing concern. His military training had taught him to recognize when civilians were approaching the point of mob behavior, and he could see that Derek's latest insult had pushed the crowd beyond the limits of peaceful protest. Derek seemed to feed off the crowd's hostility rather than being intimidated by it. The attention he was receiving felt like validation of his importance and his willingness to speak truths that others were too cowardly to voice. He had no understanding of how seriously the British people took insults to their institutions and their history. Look at all of you. Derek taunted the crowd, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mock welcome. Getting all worked up because someone told you the truth about your pathetic little country? You used to rule the world, and now you can't even handle one American tourist speaking his mind. Jessica Walsh, the university student who had been recording the confrontation, watched in fascination and horror as Derek systematically destroyed any possibility of a peaceful resolution. Her international relations professors had taught her about the importance of cultural sensitivity and diplomatic courtesy. But seeing someone violate every principle so thoroughly was both educational and appalling. Linda Matthews finally found her voice and tried desperately to intervene. Before her husband could cause any more damage, "Derek, please," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Let's just go back to the hotel. We've seen enough for today." Derek jerked his arm away from his wife's grasp with such force that she stumbled backward into the crowd. The sight of him treating his own wife roughly while simultaneously insulting their country pushed several British men past their breaking point. "Don't you dare put your hands on her like that." David Hartwell, the young man whose grandfather had flown Spitfires, stepped forward with his fists clenched. "You want to act like a tough guy? Try picking on someone your own size, instead of insulting dead heroes and pushing women around." Derek found himself facing a crowd that was no longer content to simply argue with him verbally. The combination of his insults to British military history, his disrespect toward the monarchy, and his rough treatment of his wife had created a perfect storm of righteous anger that was quickly approaching violence. "You people don't scare me," Derek declared, though his voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there earlier. "I've dealt with tougher crowds than this back home. You're all just upset because you know I'm right about your country being irrelevant in the modern world." "Officer." Lee's backup arrived in the form of 4 additional security personnel, all trained in crowd control and diplomatic incident management. They quickly formed a protective barrier around Derek while Officer Henley attempted to de-escalate the situation through negotiation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the crowd, "I understand that you're upset by this gentleman's comments, but I need everyone to step back and allow us to handle this situation professionally. Violence will not solve anything, and it will only create more problems for everyone involved." The crowd reluctantly began to give ground, but their anger was far from dissipated. Many continued to shout questions and challenges at Derek, who seemed incapable of recognizing that his situation was becoming increasingly precarious. "That's right," Derek yelled at the retreating crowd. "Run away when someone finally tells you the truth. Just like you always do when things get tough. No wonder you needed American soldiers to save you from the Germans." The historical reference to World War II, delivered as the crowd was trying to calm down at the request of security officers, reignited their fury. Several people began pushing forward again, forcing the security team to tighten their protective formation around Derek. Guard Captain Thornton made a subtle adjustment to his stance, preparing himself mentally for the possibility that he might need to abandon his ceremonial duties to help maintain order. The situation had deteriorated far beyond anything he had witnessed during his years of guard duty, and he could see that. Derek remained completely oblivious to the danger he had created. The cameras continued rolling as Derek Matthews, a middle-aged construction company owner from Texas, stood surrounded by British security officers while dozens of angry British citizens demanded his removal from their country's most sacred ceremonial site. His red MAGA hat had become a symbol of everything they found offensive about American arrogance and cultural insensitivity. The price Derek would pay for his behavior was only beginning to become apparent, and the consequences would extend far beyond the immediate confrontation in the castle courtyard. Officer Henley made the decision that would change Derek Matthews' vacation from an unpleasant diplomatic incident into a life-altering catastrophe. After consulting briefly with her supervisor via radio, she turned to Derek with an expression that had shifted from professional patience to official authority. "Mr. Matthews," she said, using his name for the first time after checking his passport information through security channels, "you're under arrest for breach of the peace, disorderly conduct, and disruption of official ceremonial proceedings. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right." Derek's face went white as the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his wall of arrogance and self-importance. Being arrested in a foreign country was not something his wealth and business connections could easily fix, and the implications for his construction company and his family's reputation were starting to become clear. "You can't arrest me," Derek protested as Officer Henley began the process of placing him in custody. "I'm an American citizen. I have diplomatic immunity. I haven't committed any crimes." The crowd that had been demanding Derek's removal from the premises now watched with satisfaction as justice appeared to be taking its course. Their anger was beginning to transform into something approaching pity for Linda Matthews, who stood nearby looking absolutely devastated by her husband's behavior and its consequences. "Sir," Officer Henley replied calmly, "tourists do not have diplomatic immunity, and your citizenship doesn't protect you from the consequences of breaking British laws. You've been warned multiple times about your disruptive behavior, and you chose to escalate the situation rather than comply with reasonable requests." As Derek was being processed for arrest, the phones that had been recording his outburst were already uploading videos to social media platforms around the world. Jessica Walsh's footage, in particular, captured the entire sequence of events with crystal clarity, showing Derek's progression from arrogant tourist to arrested criminal in real time. The first news outlet to pick up the story was a local British paper that specialized in royal family coverage. Their headline read, "American tourist arrested after insulting Queen and military at Windsor Castle," within hours. The story had been picked up by international news services and was trending on multiple social media platforms back in Texas. Derek's construction company employees were beginning to see their bosses' arrests playing out on their phones and computer screens. The contrast between Derek's public image as a successful businessman and his behavior as a belligerent tourist was stark, enough to shock even people who had worked with him for years. Linda Matthews found herself in the surreal position of having to contact the American embassy to report her husband's arrest while simultaneously dealing with the embarrassment of his very public meltdown. The embassy officials she spoke with were professional, but clearly frustrated by having to handle another case of American tourists behaving badly abroad. Guard Captain Thornton maintained his ceremonial position throughout Derek's arrest, but internally he felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the disruptive tourist had been removed and the ceremony could continue with appropriate dignity, but sadness that diplomatic relations between allied countries had to be strained by one man's ignorance and disrespect. The crowd began to disperse as Derek was led away in handcuffs, but the damage to America's reputation among the witnesses had already been done. Many of the British tourists who had watched the incident unfold would carry negative impressions of American tourists for years to come, all because of one man's inability to show basic respect for his hosts. Derek's red MAGA hat, which had fallen to the ground during his arrest, was eventually picked up by a maintenance worker and thrown in the trash. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on the remaining observers, many of whom saw it as a metaphor for the decline of American prestige and respect around the world. At the local police station, Derek was processed through the British legal system with the same bureaucratic efficiency. He handled thousands of similar cases each year. His demands to speak with the American ambassador, his threats to sue everyone involved, and his continued insistence that he had done nothing wrong were all noted in his file but changed nothing about his situation. The holding cell Derek found himself in was clean but austere. A far cry from the luxury hotel suite he had booked for his European vacation. For the first time since the incident began, he was alone with his thoughts and beginning to understand that his actions might have consequences that extended far beyond a few hours of inconvenience. Meanwhile, the videos of his arrest were being shared millions of times across social media platforms. Comments ranged from expressions of support for the British authorities to embarrassment from other Americans who felt Derek had disgraced their country's reputation. The hashtag #UglyAmericanTourist began trending worldwide, with Derek's face becoming the primary example of entitled American behavior abroad. His construction company's phone lines were jammed with calls from reporters seeking comment on their CEO's arrest, while potential clients began canceling contracts and expressing concerns about being associated with someone who had caused such an international embarrassment. The business Derek had spent decades building was being damaged by a single morning's worth of bad decisions. Linda Matthews spent the day bouncing between the police station, the American embassy, and their hotel room, trying to manage the crisis while dealing with her own shock and embarrassment. She had known Derek could be difficult and opinionated, but she had never imagined he was capable of the level of disrespect and cultural insensitivity she had witnessed at Windsor Castle. The British press was having a field day with the story, using Derek's arrest as an example of everything they found problematic about American political culture and international behavior. Editorial writers drew connections between Derek's personal conduct and broader patterns of American foreign policy, using his individual actions to make points about national character and international relations. Back at Windsor Castle, the changing of the guard ceremony had resumed its normal dignity and pageantry. Guard Captain Thornton and his colleagues performed their duties with the same precision and professionalism they brought to the role every day. But the morning's events had reminded them all of the importance of what they represented and why their traditions mattered. The tourists who remained after Derek's arrest watched the ceremony with a renewed sense of respect and appreciation. Having witnessed someone disrespect the tradition so thoroughly, they had a better understanding of why these ceremonies were considered sacred by the British people and why they deserved to be observed with appropriate reverence. Derek Matthews had succeeded in making himself famous, but not in the way he had intended. His name was now known around the world, but as a cautionary tale about the consequences of arrogance, disrespect, and cultural insensitivity. The price he would pay for his behavior was only beginning to become apparent, and the full consequences would follow him long after he returned to Texas. 24 hours after his arrest at Windsor Castle, Derek Matthews sat in a stark interview room at Thames Valley Police Headquarters, facing charges that could result in significant fines, a permanent criminal record, and potential deportation from the United Kingdom. His expensive vacation had transformed into a legal nightmare that would have consequences, extending far beyond his current confinement. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, a veteran officer experienced in handling cases involving foreign nationals, sat across from Derek with a thick file containing witness statements, video evidence, and documentation of his disruptive behavior. The case against him was overwhelming, supported by dozens of witnesses and clear video footage of his actions. Mr. Matthews, Detective Morrison began in a professional tone, "You're facing serious charges under the Public Order Act, breach of the peace. Disorderly conduct and disruption of ceremonial proceedings are not minor infractions. Given the location and nature of your behavior, the Crown Prosecution Service is treating this as a particularly serious case." Derek had spent the night in a holding cell, and the experience had somewhat deflated his earlier bravado. The reality of being processed through a foreign legal system, combined with the growing awareness of how his arrest was being covered in international media, had finally begun to penetrate his wall of self-importance. "Detective, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Derek said, trying to adopt a more conciliatory tone than he had used the previous day. "I was just expressing my opinions as an American citizen. I never meant to cause any real problems. Can't we just chalk this up to cultural differences and move on?" Detective Morrison consulted her notes before responding. "Mr. Matthews, we have testimony from over 30 witnesses describing your behavior as deliberately provocative and disrespectful. You insulted British military history, called the Queen a welfare queen, and became increasingly aggressive when asked to moderate your behavior. This goes well beyond cultural misunderstandings." Meanwhile, the media coverage of Derek's arrest had exploded into a full-scale international incident. British tabloids were running headlines like "Yankee Doodle Dandy goes too far and Trump tourists royal tantrum," while American news outlets were using the story to discuss broader issues of international diplomacy and tourist behavior. Abroad, CNN had picked up the story with the headline, "Texas man arrested after anti-royal outburst at Windsor Castle," while Fox News was framing it as American tourists targeted by British police for free speech. Political polarization that Derek embodied was now being played out on an international stage, with his personal behavior becoming a proxy for larger cultural and political debates. Back in Texas, Derek's construction company was in full crisis mode. His business partner, Tom Rodriguez, was fielding dozens of calls from angry clients who wanted to distance themselves from the company following Derek's very public embarrassment. Several major contracts were being canceled, and the company's reputation in the competitive Dallas construction market was suffering severe damage. Derek's always been outspoken, Tom explained to a reporter from the Dallas Morning News, but none of us expected anything like this. His personal political views don't represent the company, and we're trying to minimize the damage to our employees in existing projects. Linda Matthews was dealing with her own crisis, having to manage not only her husband's legal situation, but also the avalanche of media attention that had descended on their family. Their hotel room had become a fortress, with reporters camped outside and photographers trying to capture images of the wife of the ugly American tourist. The American embassy had assigned a consular officer to Derek's case, but their ability to help was limited by the clear evidence of his guilt and the serious nature of the charges. Embassy officials were privately frustrated by having to deal with another case of American tourists damaging diplomatic relationships through their own poor behavior. Mr. Matthews, the consular officer had explained during their meeting, the embassy's role is to ensure you receive fair treatment under British law, not to get you out of the consequences of your actions. The evidence against you is substantial, and the charges are legitimate under British legal standards. The videos of Derek's outburst and arrests had gone viral across social media platforms, spawning countless memes, commentary videos, and political debates. His image, frozen in a moment of rage while wearing his red MAGA hat, had become a symbol used by people across the political spectrum to make points about American behavior abroad. British social media users were sharing the videos with comments like, "This is why the world thinks Americans are arrogant and imagine traveling to another country just to insult their history and traditions." American users were divided, with some defending Derek's right to free speech, while others expressed embarrassment at his behavior representing their country abroad. The hashtag Derek Matthews is trending alongside hashtag ugly American tourist, with millions of people weighing in on everything from American foreign policy to the importance of cultural sensitivity when traveling. Political commentators on both sides of the Atlantic were using Derek's case to make broader points about nationalism, respect for allies, and the state of international relations. Guard Captain William Thornton had returned to his regular duties, but he found himself the subject of considerable media attention as well. British newspapers were praising his professionalism and restraint in the face of Derek's provocations, holding him up as an example of military discipline and national dignity. That young man showed exactly what British military service means. Arthur Pemberton, The naval veteran who had confronted Derek told a BBC reporter. He maintained his composure and his duty, while some ignorant tourist tried to belittle everything he represents. That's real strength. Back in the police interview room, Derek was beginning to understand the full scope of his legal problems. Detective Morrison had laid out the potential penalties he was facing: substantial fines, a criminal record that would affect his ability to travel internationally, and possible deportation with a ban on returning to the UK. Mr. Matthews, Detective Morrison continued, "The prosecutor is prepared to recommend leniency if you're willing to accept responsibility for your actions and offer a formal public apology to the institutions and individuals you insulted. However, given the international attention this case has received, any apology would need to be genuine and comprehensive." Derek struggled with the concept of apologizing for behavior that he still didn't fully understand was wrong. In his worldview, he had simply expressed legitimate opinions about American superiority and British weakness. The idea that his hosts might deserve respect and courtesy regardless of his political views was still foreign to his thinking. "What kind of apology are we talking about?" Derek asked, his business instincts recognizing a negotiation opportunity. Even in his current predicament, a public acknowledgement that your behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful. Detective Morrison replied, "Recognition of the service and sacrifice of British military personnel, both historical and current, and an understanding that guests in any country should show basic courtesy to their hosts, regardless of political differences." Meanwhile, Derek's arrest had triggered a broader conversation about American tourist behavior abroad. Travel industry professionals were using his case as an example of how not to represent one's country when traveling, while cultural sensitivity experts were discussing the importance of understanding and respecting local customs and traditions. The American travel industry was particularly concerned about the potential long-term damage to their reputation. Tourism boards and travel agencies were issuing statements distancing themselves from Derek's behavior, while emphasizing the importance of cultural respect and appropriate behavior when Americans traveled abroad. Linda Matthews had finally been allowed to visit her husband at the police station. Their conversation was tense and difficult. She had spent the previous day dealing with the consequences of his actions, while he remained largely oblivious to the broader impact of his behavior. "Derek, you have to understand what you've done," Linda pleaded with him. "This isn't just about you anymore. Our family, your business, even America's reputation, everything is being affected by what happened." Yesterday, Derek looked at his wife with genuine confusion, still unable to fully grasp how expressing his political opinions had created such an enormous crisis. "Linda, I was just telling the truth about how things really are. Why is everyone making such a big deal out of this?" The disconnect between Derek's perception of his behavior and the reality of its impact was becoming increasingly clear to everyone involved in his case. His inability to understand why insulting his host's history, traditions, and institutions might be problematic suggested deeper issues with empathy and cultural awareness that went beyond simple political disagreements. Detective Morrison had dealt with hundreds of similar cases over her career, but Derek's combination of arrogance and genuine bewilderment was unusual even in her experience. Most people who found themselves in legal trouble abroad at least understood why their behavior had been problematic, even if they regretted the consequences more than the actions themselves. The international media attention was continuing to grow, Derek's case being discussed on talk shows, news programs, and political commentary shows around the world. His 15 minutes of fame had extended far beyond anything he could have imagined, but the price of that fame was becoming clearer with each passing hour. 6 months after his arrest at Windsor Castle, Derek Matthews sat in his nearly empty office in Dallas, staring at the foreclosure notice that had arrived that morning. His construction company, once worth several $1,000,000, had collapsed under the weight of canceled contracts, lost clients, and the toxic reputation he had created during his disastrous vacation to England. The legal consequences of his British arrest had been severe but manageable: a substantial fine, a criminal record that banned him from returning to the UK, and a formal apology that had been broadcast internationally. But the business and personal consequences had proven to be far more devastating than any legal penalty. Derek's formal apology, delivered under legal pressure and clearly lacking genuine remorse, had only made his situation worse. His wooden delivery and obvious reluctance to acknowledge wrongdoing had been dissected by media commentators as an example of how not to apologize for international incidents. I regret that my words were misinterpreted and caused offense to some people. Derek had read from a prepared statement, his lawyer's careful language fooling no one. I understand that cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings, and I should have been more sensitive to local customs. The non-apology apology had sparked another round of negative coverage, with British media outlets mocking Derek's refusal to take genuine responsibility for his behavior. American commentators were divided. But even those who sympathized with his political views criticized his handling of the diplomatic crisis he had created. Tom Rodriguez, Derek's former business partner, bought out Derek's share of the company for a fraction of its former value and immediately rebranded the business to distance it from Derek's toxic reputation. Most of their former employees had found work elsewhere. Unable to wait for the company's recovery from the scandal, Derek never understood that business is about relationships. Tom explained to a trade publication interviewing him about the company's recovery. When you damage those relationships through personal behavior, it affects everything else you try to do. Clients don't want to be associated with controversy and embarrassment. Linda Matthews had filed for divorce 3 months after Derek's return from England, citing irreconcilable differences and her inability to continue living with someone whose behavior had brought such shame to their family. She had taken their 2 teenage children and moved to her sister's house in Houston, trying to rebuild their lives away from the media attention that still followed Derek. The divorce proceedings had been particularly painful, with Linda's testimony about Derek's pattern of arrogant and disrespectful behavior providing insight into the personality traits that had led to his British meltdown. Court documents revealed years of similar incidents on a smaller scale, suggesting that the Windsor Castle confrontation was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern. Derek's social media accounts, once filled with political commentary and business updates, had been largely abandoned after the harassment and mockery he received following his viral arrest videos. The constant stream of memes, critical comments, and references to his behavior had made maintaining an online presence impossible. The financial costs of his legal troubles had been enormous. Between legal fees, fines, travel expenses, and lost business revenue, Derek estimated that his 15 minutes of international fame had cost him nearly everything he had spent his adult life building. His house, a sprawling mansion in an exclusive Dallas suburb that had once been featured in local lifestyle magazines, was now on the market. The real estate agent had warned Derek that the notoriety associated with his name was affecting the property's value, with potential buyers concerned about purchasing a home that might be associated with negative publicity. Guard Captain William Thornton, meanwhile, had received commendations from his superiors for his professional handling of the incident. He had been promoted and was now helping to train other ceremonial guards in dealing with difficult tourists and maintaining dignity under pressure. The Derek Matthews incident became a teaching example for us, Captain Thornton explained to new recruits during training sessions. It showed how maintaining military bearing and professionalism, even in the face of extreme provocation, ultimately reflects well on the service and the nation. Our job is to represent something larger than ourselves, regardless of how individuals choose to behave around us. The videos of Derek's confrontation and arrest had become part of cultural sensitivity training programs used by travel companies, diplomatic services, and international business organizations. His behavior was held up as an example of how personal prejudices and cultural arrogance could create serious professional and legal problems. Derek himself had become something of a cautionary tale in business and political circles. His rapid fall from successful entrepreneur to international embarrassment was studied by crisis management experts and used by political strategists as an example of how personal behavior could undermine professional success. Sitting alone in his failing office, Derek still struggled to understand how expressing his political opinions had led to such comprehensive personal and professional destruction. His inability to recognize the difference between having controversial views and showing basic respect for others continued to blind him to the real reasons for his downfall. The few friends who still maintained contact with Derek reported that he remained largely unchanged by his experiences. He still blamed his problems on political correctness, foreign sensitivities, and jealous competitors rather than acknowledging his own role in creating the crisis that had destroyed his life. The international incident that Derek had sparked at Windsor Castle had faded from the news cycle, replaced by other stories and controversies. But the consequences for Derek continued to compound daily, serving as a permanent reminder that in an interconnected world, personal behavior could have global ramifications. His red MAGA hat, the symbol that had started the entire confrontation, sat in a box in his nearly empty office, a relic of the confidence and arrogance that had once defined his worldview. The hat represented not just his political beliefs, but his fundamental inability to understand that respect and courtesy were not signs of weakness but foundations of civilized interaction between people and nations. Derek Matthews had gotten the international attention he seemed to crave, but the price had been everything he had worked to build over his entire adult life. His legacy would be that of the ugly American tourist whose behavior had damaged relationships, reinforced negative stereotypes, and ultimately destroyed himself in the process.